June 26, 1522. The island of Rhodes, the eastern Mediterranean. Picture this. You are standing on the walls of the most heavily fortified city in the known world. Stone battlements 30 feet thick at the base. Towers built for exactly this moment. Moats cut deep into the rock. Every wall, every angle, every approach designed by engineers who spent their entire careers thinking about one single problem: how to stop an Ottoman army. You have been waiting for this day for years. And now, it is here. On the horizon, the Ottoman fleet has appeared. Not a dozen ships, not 100. You count the sails, and you stop counting because the number stops meaning anything. Over 400 vessels carrying the largest siege train ever assembled in the history of the Mediterranean world. Behind them, an army that historians will later estimate at between 100,000 and 200,000 men. Suleiman the Magnificent himself is coming. Not a general, not a vizier, the Sultan in person, with the full military weight of the Ottoman Empire behind him. Because he has decided that this island, this small rocky island at the edge of his empire, is the one thing he cannot leave standing. Your garrison numbers 7,000 men. Knights Hospitaller, the finest defensive soldiers in the world. Men who have trained for siege warfare since childhood. Men who have held this island for 2 centuries against every force that has tried to take it. By every calculation of military logic, this should end in days. Now watch what happens. The garrison of Rhodes, held for 6 months. The walls absorbed bombardment on a scale the medieval world had never seen. Suleiman lost tens of thousands of men and nearly lost his reputation as an invincible commander before the island finally fell. And when it did, it fell not because the knights broke, but because they ran out of men to replace the dead. By the end of this video, you will know exactly how 7,000 soldiers made the greatest empire on earth bleed for every stone of that island, and why the fall of Rhodes was one of the most expensive victories in Ottoman history. If this is the kind of history you enjoy? Subscribe. A new battle every week. To understand what happened at Rhodes in 1522, you need to understand what the Knights Hospitaller actually were. They were not a local militia. They were not a conscript army. They were a military religious order founded in the 11th century during the Crusades, originally established to care for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem. Within a century, they had become something else entirely. Warrior monks, professional soldiers who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and who spent their lives learning to fight. When the Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land collapsed in the late 13th century, the knights needed a base. They took Cyprus briefly. Then, in 1309, they conquered Rhodes, and they spent the next 213 years turning it into a fortress. This is the part that Leopold of Habsburg did not understand about the Swiss at Morgarten, the part that matters every time a large force faces a small one that chose its ground deliberately. The knights had 2 centuries to build exactly the defenses they wanted. Every wall was a lesson from a previous siege. Every tower incorporated improvements learned from watching how the Ottomans attacked. They had faced a previous Ottoman siege in 1480. Mehmed the Conqueror had tried to take Rhodes and failed. The knights studied that failure for 40 years and built against it. By 1522, Rhodes was not just a city with walls, it was a machine designed to kill besieging armies. Fortifications followed the Trace Italienne design, low-angled bastions built to deflect cannon fire rather than absorb it vertically. The walls were doubled in places, with a second inner wall behind the outer one so that a breach in the exterior did not mean the end. The moat was not just dug. It was engineered, with listening posts built into the rock, so defenders could hear Ottoman miners working underground before they finished their tunnels. 7,000 men defending a position like that are not 7,000 men. They are a multiplier. The walls do half the work. Suleiman knew all of this. He came anyway, because he had no choice. Rhodes sat at the intersection of the Ottoman Empire's maritime ambitions and its land-based power. Every ship moving between Constantinople and Egypt, between the Ottoman heartland and North Africa, had to pass within range of Rhodes. The knights used that position to raid Ottoman shipping, to intercept supply lines, to shelter the Sultan's enemies. They were the thorn in the side of an empire that controlled everything around them. Suleiman had taken the throne in 1520 at the age of 25. In his first 2 years, he had already seized Belgrade, the gateway to Central Europe. and was consolidating an empire that stretched from Persia to the Adriatic. A professional military order sitting on an island 40 miles off his coastline was not a threat he could ignore. He sent a demand for surrender in the spring of 1522. The Grand Master of the Knights was Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, 57 years old, a Frenchman, a career soldier who had spent his entire adult life in service to the order. He received Suleiman's ultimatum, considered it for the appropriate amount of time, and declined. Preparations began immediately on both sides. Suleiman assembled the force at a scale Rhodes had never faced before. The 1480 siege had involved perhaps 70,000 Ottoman soldiers. This time the number was nearly double. The artillery train alone required hundreds of ships to transport, great bombards capable of firing stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, bronze cannons that could reduce a section of wall to rubble in hours, and hundreds of smaller pieces for suppressing the battlements. l'Isle-Adam sent urgent requests to the Christian powers of Europe for reinforcements. Almost none came. Spain was occupied with the New World. France was at war with the Holy Roman Empire. England sent nothing. The Pope sent money and prayers. The Knights of Rhodes, who had spent 2 centuries defending Christendom's eastern flank, faced the greatest army in the world with the garrison they already had, and a handful of volunteers who made it to the island before the Ottoman fleet closed the sea lanes. 7,000 men, 400 knights of the order itself, supported by soldiers, mercenaries, and Rhodian Greeks, who knew this island was their home as much as it was anyone's. The fleet arrived on June 26th. The bombardment began almost immediately. What Suleiman had brought to Rhodes was not just the largest army the island had ever faced. It was the most advanced siege operation in the world. The Ottoman Empire had developed military engineering into a science over the preceding century, and at Rhodes, in 1522, they deployed all of it simultaneously. The cannon bombardment was continuous, day and night. The Ottomans rotated their gun crews so the firing never stopped, calculating that the defenders would be unable to sleep, unable to repair damage, unable to do anything except absorb punishment and try to stay alive behind walls that were being ground down hour by hour. Alongside the artillery, the Ottoman miners went to work. This was the part that the knights had specifically prepared for and still could not entirely stop. Mining was the siege technology of the era. Teams of men digging tunnels beneath the walls, packing the end of the tunnel with combustible material, and then burning it to collapse the tunnel and bring the wall section above it crashing down. The Rhodian listening network detected most of the tunnels in time to drive countermines, tunnels dug to intercept the Ottoman miners underground, sometimes breaking through into the Ottoman tunnel while the miners were still working. The fighting that happened in those underground passages, in total darkness, in spaces barely wide enough for one man, was among the most brutal of the entire siege. Some tunnels got through. On July 28th, an Ottoman mine detonated beneath the Bastion of England, one of the 8 national sections of the wall, each maintained and defended by a different lang of the order. The explosion brought down a section of wall and created a breach wide enough for an assault column to enter. The Ottomans charged into it immediately. The knights were already waiting on the other side. This is the moment that defined the Siege of Rhodes. Over and over again, in breach after breach, across 6 months of continuous assault, the pattern repeated. The Ottomans would open a hole in the outer wall. The knights would have built a second defensive line behind it during the night, using rubble from the wall itself, packing it into barricades that turned every breach into a killing ground. The assault columns that poured through the gaps found not an open city, but another wall, another prepared position, more defenders who had been resting in rotation specifically for this moment. l'Isle-Adam had organized the defense with extraordinary precision. Every man had a rotation: sleep, eat, fight, repair. Sleep, eat, fight, repair. The garrison was exhausted, but it never collapsed into the kind of disorganized desperation that ends a siege quickly. They were professionals. They had a system, and they followed it even as the walls crumbled around them. The summer wore on. August, September, October. The Ottomans took the outer works. They took the advanced positions. They pushed the perimeter in, meter by meter, at enormous cost. Suleiman's casualties mounted in a way that no one had anticipated. A force of 100,000 men should have overwhelmed 7,000 defenders in weeks. The knights made it last months. Now imagine you are inside those walls in October 1522. The city around you is barely recognizable. The buildings that were not demolished for rubble to reinforce the barricades have been damaged by cannon fire. The streets are dust and broken stone. The hospital the order had maintained for over 2 centuries is full. There are no fresh reinforcements coming. The sea lanes are completely closed by the Ottoman fleet. You know exactly how many men you have left. The number is far smaller than what it was in June. But the walls are still standing, and you are still in them. The Ottoman army is suffering from disease, the summer heat, the proximity of tens of thousands of men, the decomposing dead that could not always be removed quickly. The camp outside the walls has become a source of illness that is killing Ottoman soldiers faster than the knights can in some periods. Suleiman's commanders are advising him to consider a negotiated settlement. He refuses, because surrender is not available to him either. He is the Sultan. He came personally. He brought the full weight of his empire. If he sails home without Rhodes, it is not a setback. It is a humiliation that will follow him for the rest of his reign. The siege continues. By late November, the garrison had been reduced to fewer than 3,500 effective fighters. The walls had been breached in multiple places. The inner defensive lines were holding, but barely. The city itself was indefensible in any conventional sense. The knights had been killing Ottomans at a rate that would have ended most sieges 3 times over, but they were running out of the one resource that no amount of engineering and professional skill could replace: men. On December 10th, 1522, Lyle Adam opened negotiations. This is not the moment the knights broke. This is the moment their Grand Master made the calculation that a garrison of fewer than 3,500 exhausted men in a partially demolished city could not hold indefinitely, that continued resistance would end in the complete annihilation of the order, and that the order surviving to fight another day was worth more than dying to the last man in a city that could no longer be defended. He asked Suleiman for terms. Suleiman, who had just spent 6 months and somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 dead and wounded to take a small island from 7,000 men, granted them generous terms. The knights could leave with their lives, their weapons, their possessions, and their relics. The civilian population would not be harmed. The Greek Rhodians, who had fought alongside the order, would be protected. Suleiman reportedly said after the surrender that it caused him no small sorrow to be compelled to drive this old man from his home. On January 1st, 1523, Lil Adam and the surviving knights sailed away from Rhodes. Suleiman stood on the dock and watched them go. The fall of Rhodes sent a shock through Christian Europe that the continent had not felt since Constantinople fell in 1453. The knights had been the Eastern shield for 70 years. Now the shield was gone. The Ottomans controlled the Eastern Mediterranean without serious naval opposition for the next 2 decades. The sea lanes that Rhodes had threatened were now open. North African expansion, the consolidation of Ottoman power in Egypt and the Levant, the ability to project force into the Western Mediterranean, all of it became possible in a way it had not been before. But the knights did not disappear. They spent 7 years in exile, moving between European courts, before the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V gave them the island of Malta in 1530. They spent the next 35 years rebuilding, fortifying, training, preparing for the next time the Ottomans came. In 1565, Suleiman sent his fleet to Malta. The knights held for 4 months and drove the Ottomans back into the sea. The Great Siege of Malta became one of the most celebrated defensive victories in European history. But it was built on everything the order learned at Rhodes: about siege engineering, about rotation, about the difference between a garrison that is organized and one that is merely brave. Morgarten proved that preparation beats privilege. Rhodes proved something related but different. 7,000 professional soldiers, given the right ground and enough time to build it into a weapon, can make 100,000 pay in blood for every meter they advance. The knights did not save Rhodes. They could not. The numbers were always against them in the end. But they turned a siege that Suleiman expected to last weeks into 6 months of grinding attrition that cost his empire tens of thousands of lives and nearly broke his reputation. There is a version of military history that measures success only in who holds the ground at the end. Lyle Adam sailed away from Rhodes on January 1st, 1523. By that measure, he lost. But Suleiman, who had come with everything, paid more than anyone had ever made him pay before. He won the island and carried the cost of it for the rest of his reign. Every military planner who came after him looked at the casualty figures from Rhodes and understood something they had not understood before. Some fortresses are not defended by walls. They are defended by the decision of the men inside them that they will not be moved easily. And that decision, held for 6 months against everything the greatest army in the world could bring, is not a defeat. It is its own kind of victory. Suleiman left Rhodes in January 1523 with an island and a butcher's bill that still troubled his historians decades later. The knights left with their lives, their order, and everything they had learned. In 1565, on a different island in the middle of the same sea, they used all of it. Watch the Great Siege of Malta now.